All right, welcome everybody to Sustaina-bite, our April edition during Earth Week. So hope that in addition to joining this activity that you are participating in a bunch of the other events that are taking place at William & Mary and in the local community this week. Sustainabite is an opportunity for us to showcase and highlight the experts and professionals on campus and across the community, and have them connect what they are doing through that lens of sustainability to broader areas. And so before we get started, one of the things that I would like to do is read the land acknowledgement for the university. So William & Mary acknowledges the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the lands our campus is on today. The Cherenhaka, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Patawamak, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respect to their tribal members past and present. If you are looking for that acknowledgement, you can also find it on the William & Mary American Indian Resource Center website. It's available for everyone. Before I hand it over to our esteemed guests, I'd also like to just highlight what we mean when we say sustainability. And we're talking about sustainability broadly, kind of depends upon the field that you're in as to what the definition for sustainability is. And so for us, it's really about the interactions between society and the environment, operating in ways that improve the well-being of all. So when we talk about sustainable futures, we are thinking about, yes, sustainable and flourishing environment, but also societies, individuals, economies, and how all these things really play together. Today's guests are going to be talking about advocacy and citizenship. So it is my privilege to introduce the Office of Community Engagement, the director of which is Melody Porter. Melody, you want to give us a little wave? Melody Porter, and Elizabeth Miller, who is the associate director, and whom we work with on a regular basis, and are really happy to have you all join us today. So I'm going to hand it over to you all to maybe tell us a little bit more about yourself and about advocacy and citizenship.
Thanks, Calandra. We're so excited to be here in Zoom land with you and to get to share. It was really wonderful when you asked us to come present, and we were excited and also like, oh my gosh, this is such a huge topic. So we will say a couple of times throughout, like, here is a bite size of approaches to thinking about advocacy and active citizenship, and a couple of tools along the way. Is as way of a little bit more of introduction. I'm still Elizabeth, and I work in the Office of Community Engagement. I'm also an alumna of William & Mary and came back professionally through an AmeriCorps position. So it has been an important part of my active citizenship development to be connected to William & Mary, and thinking about where I want to grow and stretch as well. One of the things that is important to me to keep learning and engaging around is sustainability when it comes to disability justice. And thinking of that reminded me, I'm about to send a ping to Calandra if you wouldn't mind turning on the option for there to be a transcript for this Zoom. That would be great.
Right now.
Thanks. And I'll hand it over to Melody. Melody, I'm going to go with us both being on unmute as much as we want, but you let me know if that keeps anything.
Absolutely, yes. I just had to clear my throat a little bit ago, so thought I would spare y'all that little bit of human life. But it's such an honor to be here and such a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting us, Calandra. And Elizabeth and I love presenting together and haven't done it as much lately because the world has been different. And so this is really exciting to be here with y'all today. So my name is Melody Porter, and I direct the Office of Community Engagement. And I really love Elizabeth's sharing about what she's looking to grow in. When I think about ways that I want to grow as an advocate, actually advocating for positive action around climate change and alleviating the climate crisis that we face. I, like probably others on this call, feel completely overwhelmed by it all. And I'm constantly seeking those small but powerful ways that I can work for good there. So I'm really excited about this topic because it made me think really critically about that for myself too. So I'll share a little bit about the Office of Community Engagement too, for those of y'all who are not yet familiar with our work. Our mission is to connect William and Mary in the community and to help people become educated about and involved in society. So that's just one note about language that we use. We talk about active citizenship. And by that, we're not referring to legal status or sort of which country you belong to, but the idea that we all have influence. Everything that we do influences other people in our world. And citizens take their role as members in society, whatever that means, whatever country they're in, seriously. And connected to all of that, a really important part of active citizenship is understanding the influence that we have on each other and the power that we have and our potential power for good. So as I mentioned in my intro, for me, climate change is large scale and can feel paralyzing. And I think that's probably true for most people. It's really hard for us to know where to start in terms of being an activist or advocate for change in the climate crisis, because we know that individual actions are not enough. We could all recycle every plastic bottle that we ever come across, and it still wouldn't stop the climate crisis. So when Elizabeth and I were talking about this, we thought it was really important to start off by thinking about power and what power means and how to understand it. So we're going to focus on ways to understand and use power as a frame for making change so that we can move from the idea of having to act as individuals and feeling overwhelmed to understanding what collective action can bring about and how to be a part of it. So with that, I'll just say again, like Elizabeth has, we don't have the time or expertise to teach in depth about power or any of the things that we cover in this session, but we will be sharing some highlights with you. A really, what I find very useful way to think about and understand power is presented in this TED Ed talk that Eric Liu put together. He has spent his career influencing policy within and outside of government, and he's the founder of Citizen University. And so we're going to play a little 7-minute video from him for you, because it's a really useful way for us to gain a common foundation and move forward in our conversation.
Can you hear it? Can you hear it? No.
I do not hear anything.
Yeah, y'all, how many years do we have to be on Zoom where I will still forget to hit the share sound button? Oh, great. Okay, here we go.
Yes.
Every day of your life, you move through systems of power that other people made. Do you sense them? Do you understand power? Do you realize why it matters? Power is something we're often uncomfortable talking about. That's especially true in civic life, how we live together in community. In a democracy, power is supposed to reside with the people, period. Any further talk about power, and who really has it, seems a little dirty, maybe even evil. But power is no more inherently good or evil than fire or physics. It just is. It governs how any form of government works. It determines who gets to determine the rules of the game. So learning how power operates is key to being effective, being taken seriously, and not being taken advantage of. In this lesson, we'll look at where power comes from, how it's exercised, and what you can do to become more powerful in public life. Let's start with a basic definition. Power is the ability to make others do what you would have them do. Of course, this plays out in all arenas of life, from family to the workplace to our relationships. Our focus is on the civic arena, where power means getting a community to make the choices and to take the actions that you want. There are 6 main sources of civic power. First, there's physical force and a capacity for violence. Control of the means of force, whether in the police or a militia, is power at its most primal. A second core source of power is wealth. Money creates the ability to buy results and to buy almost any other kind of power. The third form of power is state action, government. This is the use of law and bureaucracy to compel people to do or not do certain things. In a democracy, for example, we the people theoretically give government its power through elections. In a dictatorship, state power emerges from the threat of force, not the consent of the governed. The fourth type of power is social norms, or what other people think is okay. Norms don't have the centralized machinery of government. They operate in a softer way, peer-to-peer. But they can certainly make people change behavior and even change laws. Think about how norms around marriage equality today are evolving. The fifth form of power is ideas. An idea, individual liberty, say, or racial equality, can generate boundless amounts of power if it motivates enough people to change their thinking and actions. And so the sixth source of power is numbers, lots of humans. A vocal mass of people creates power by expressing collective intensity of interest and by asserting legitimacy. Think of the Arab Spring or the rise of the Tea Party. Crowds count. These are the six main sources of power, what power is. So now, let's think about how power operates. There are three laws of power worth examining. Law number one, power is never static. It's always either accumulating or decaying in the civic arena. So if you aren't taking action, you're being acted upon. Law number two, power is like water. It flows like a current through everyday life. Politics is the work of harnessing that flow in a direction you prefer. Policymaking is an effort to freeze and perpetuate a particular flow of power. Policy is power frozen. Law number three, power compounds. Power begets more power, and so does powerlessness. The only thing that keeps law number three from leading to a situation where only one person has all the power is how we apply laws 1 and 2. What rules do we set up so that a few people don't accumulate too much power and so they can't enshrine their privilege in policy? That's the question of democracy. And you can see each of these laws at work in any news story. Low-wage workers organize to get higher pay. Oil companies push to get a big pipeline approved. Gay and lesbian couples seek the legal right to marry. Urban parents demand school vouchers. You may support these efforts or not. Whether you get what you want depends on how adept you are.
Cliffhanger.
The power of the internet.
While we wait, I'll see if I can pull it up on my other screen on YouTube and see if YouTube is acting more appropriately today.
At Arizona State University, professors include one of the first women to lead a NASA deep space mission. Whether you join us on campus or
Good job, Elizabeth.
Yeah, way to problem solve.
Which brings us finally to what you can do to become more powerful in public life. Here, it's useful to think in terms of literacy. Your challenge is to learn how to read power and write power. To read power means to pay attention to as many texts of power as you can. I don't mean books only. I mean seeing society as a set of texts. Don't like how things are in your campus or city or country? Map out who has what kind of power, arrayed in what systems. Understand why it turned out this way, who's made it so, and who wants to keep it so. Study the strategies others in such situations used. Frontal attack or indirection. Coalitions or charismatic authority. Read so you may write. To write power requires first that you believe you have the right to write, to be an author of change. You do. As with any kind of writing, you learn to express yourself, speak up in a voice that's authentic, organize your ideas, then organize other people, practice consensus building, practice conflict. As with writing, it's all about practice. Every day you have a chance to practice, in your neighborhood and beyond. Set objectives, then bigger ones. Watch the patterns, see what works. Adapt, repeat. This is citizenship. In this short lesson, we've explored where civic power comes from, how it works, and what you can do to exercise it. One big question remaining is the why of power. Do you want power to benefit everyone or only you? Are your purposes pro-social or anti-social? This question isn't about strategy, it's about character. And that's another set of lessons. But remember this: power plus character equals a great citizen, and you have the power to be one.
Every time I watch that video, I feel like inspired and like I just want to sit with it and unpack everything in the content. And I have the feeling I often feel when I'm inspired, which is like, okay, now what do I do with that? So wanted to share with you all a couple of tools that help us move, as the video talks about, from understanding of power to the how do we use power around the issues, the pro-social issues that are important to us, keeping in mind that we don't have all of the time to unpack even one of those tools. So our approach is to offer a few up to you that hopefully will have you say, oh yeah, here's a step I want to take to be part of that collective action within that framework of understanding how power operates, but how we use it. And one of the resources that we have created in partnership with student unions and student leadership development is a resource guide of activism and advocacy toolkits, guides, rule books, etc., specifically for William & Mary students and those engaging in change on campus. So I put the QR code on the slide that will take you to the whole compendium of resources. We also welcome any additions to this guide, but wanted to highlight a few of them. And this first one is from the Youth Activist Toolkit, which provides a whole range of opportunities for you to think big picture of how to do that collective action work and create power. And you can see it breaks it down into these sort of 6 large steps. That piece about identifying the change you want, thinking particularly about root causes and specific demands. So what is not working in the way that power is currently flowing, and where do you want to redirect it? Crafting your message around why that's important and how you want to get others involved, tapping into that power of numbers. Thinking about strategy in particular, and this is where analyzing power can be particularly useful. How do you understand who has power and how you can influence them? Building that collective power, again, going back to the video to think about power of numbers by recruiting supporters and developing leaders, both to bring more people in, but that idea of the power of ideas. So how can you bring those who are going to create that innovation and redirect the flow? And then ways to use power and specific tactics. And I think also critically, although we won't talk about this as much, the issue of sustainability in this work. And we see that in this resource and in the resource as a whole, our guides, because one of the things we often hear, and I know I experience myself, is there's both the sense of overwhelm of how can I make change when I'm addressing these global issues, but also when I begin to engage in the work, that overwhelm of I'm in it, how can I sustain my own energy and the collective power around it, and what we often see in term as activism burnout. So some of the ways to address that. So this toolkit gives you lots of resources within those 6 steps. And I will have Melody, I'll move us on to the next slide. So I clicked on the wrong screen to talk a little bit about one of those resources or those tools.
So power mapping is an important way to think about who has power, because if you want to influence people for change, you need to know who to influence. And power mapping is a way to do it. Google will give you a lot of advice on how to do that. So I'm not going to walk through the how right now, but I do want to just give you a little taste, a little amuse-bouche of power mapping for your Sustaina-bite today. Let's discuss. If people are up for it, you can unmute yourself and share, or you can drop something in the chat. Thinking about on campus, who has the power to change housing policy? It's not just one person or one body necessarily, but who do you think? Who are some of the people who have that power? It's hard to answer, isn't it? So I'll throw some ideas out. When I was thinking of that question, I'm thinking about the floor, the residents of the floor themselves with self-determination. The staff, the residence life staff, the head residents, the RAs, the area directors, the head of campus living, the head of residence life, Ginger Ambler, who also oversees all of student affairs, and really the board of visitors. So all of those people have a stake in housing policy. And if you were thinking about something that you wanted to change, you would have to think about the level at which that specific decision is made and start there. Another question, this one might be a little bit easier. Think about who has the power to change curriculum at William and Mary.
Faculty.
Yes, ma'am. That's right. It's faculty. And it's faculty working together in groups, doing so in a, I think, democratic way. Exactly, on committees. Thank you, Camille, with curriculum committees, with dean's involvement. But yes, that's a very different power structure than like housing policy power structures. Now thinking about in community, who has the power to influence and regulate energy sources? Completely out of my expertise here, so I'm going to tell you what I think. Is anybody on the call who knows? State Departments of Energy, very good resource, Camille, thank you. I think also energy companies have the power to influence energy sources, right? They're really good at lobbying and influencing the state departments of energy. Local government also has some influence. So power is at many different levels. And we wanted to talk about this particular tool because it's important when you're thinking about climate change. Your influence doesn't have to be influencing the UN. It can be influencing your city council member, and local change is significant in this world. A lot of times we tend to think like it's the administration or it's the government. Break it down so that you know who to actually talk to. And now we'll talk a little bit about some different tactics that you can use.
Yeah, so one of the things that is important in thinking about how we're creating change is how we're going about making that influence happen. And one of the resources that I really like in our activist toolkits that are shared is looking at tactics. So these are just a few that I have seen be active tools on our campus, but the resource actually includes over 100 different tactics for change that have been used throughout history. So everything in this case, thinking about ways that you're spreading the information to others, right? Gaining power and influence by more people knowing about it, by applying pressure through walkouts or boycotts, engaging in creative action. Some of the best work I have seen in the last few years around advocacy, both in terms of disability justice and climate justice, has been creative expressions, because it often taps into shared values and an ability to, in some ways, challenge, but also soothe our sense of, oh my gosh, everything is too big and we can't tackle it, because it invites us to imagine a different way of looking at the world through creative expression, or a different way to look at what could exist. So thinking about some of the tactics that we have seen happen on this campus and others can be a really useful tool for thinking about, when we've mapped out who has power and what level of influence, what are the particular strategies or tactics that we think will influence them to make change and influence others to join us in applying pressure around change. So again, I won't go through the list of 100, but wanted to highlight the fact that there are lots of different ways to take these kinds of actions. And you can think about what your skill set is to align with the tools that make sense for you. And I know I'm someone who, even looking at a list that's winnowed down, is still thinking about, okay, but how do I actually write a letter to the editor? What does it mean to organize a boycott? I've never done that before. I've read about it. So I wanted to also highlight one other toolkit that's on our guide. This is from Student PIRG, which is the Public Interest Research Group. And their toolkit is very good at getting into the specific how-tos. They have these broad themes around recruitment, leadership, development, organizing, and working with the media. But then they have like a one-page, how do you effectively table? Like, what are the strategies you use? Things like standing in front of the table instead of behind it. How do you ask a faculty member if you can come in and make an announcement about some sort of policy change you're advocating for? What does it look like to write an op-ed or a news release? Something that I still don't feel confident in my skills to do. I tried it once and I should try it again. But for me, just having this resource to go to and see where students and other people working for change have written out the step-by-step really helps me feel more confident that I am engaging power in ways that have been proven effective in the past. So this toolkit is available for anyone to use and download. And what I like about this and the one before is you can really apply it across issues. Some of them have an issue focus to them, but there are so many pieces of climate change policy, sustainability policy that we all feel drawn to. And so having some tools that can apply across has been useful.
I want to talk about one way that you can use your influence as an individual by joining many voices, and that is by being part of the political and electoral processes. So campaigning means that your vote counts. We know that our electoral system is strong in the United States, but when you campaign, you can help other people to have all the information they need to vote, and you can try to influence them to vote the same way that you would like for them to. It's a way to get your values in office. So one of my most formative experiences, when I was 12 years old, my friend's mom ran for school board and she had us standing on the median waving signs. And I still remember she gave me a printed off list of 400 names of people to call to ask to vote for her. She won that election, and it was an early way for me to see the power of just person to person influence. And she went on to implement a lot of really good policies in our local schools. When we're thinking about climate change, it's really smart to think about who makes money off the climate crisis and how do you influence those people? Because if they're making money in our capitalist system, they're not going to stop or slow down unless they have different values around that. One coalition that I have so much admiration for is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. They work for food justice and they have a fair food movement. they use so many different tactics. Maybe some of y'all have heard of them before, but they do everything from street theaters to boycotts. They send speakers out to religious organizations and civic groups. They do marches, and I actually got a group of friends to join them once by just writing letters to our grocery store managers, which resulted in me having a really awkward face-to-face with the assistant manager of my Kroger when I was talking to him about where he's getting tomatoes from. What makes this awkward is that sometimes we feel like we have to be experts, and that can keep us from jumping in. But what I would say is I was able to give this assistant manager all the information that I knew about tomatoes. And when he asked questions that I didn't know the answer to, I said, I don't know the answers to this, but here are more resources on it. And it's really important to me as a shopper here that you start changing your practices. That's what he needed to hear. He didn't need to know all the details of the answers that he was asking questions about. So I think a big barrier for a lot of us is a want to be right and an insecurity about not knowing everything. And I share that example of so many others of times that I've advocated and like not known everything, but because it's impossible to. But I've known enough to express myself and to be heard. And that's a really nice way to claim power.
That makes me think, Melody, when we were at a climate justice session a few weeks ago with one of our elected representatives, and I was asking about, like, what do you want to hear on the phone from a constituent? What makes you move around these issues? And what he shared was that often the places of movement come from someone sharing their personal story and experience with the topic, right? So one, I'm your constituent, this is important to me, power, but also that human, like, here's how my life has been affected. And we all have experience, we all have expertise in our personal experience. And so the ability to make those human connections to say, I'm going to choose to shop differently, not just so that you shop differently, but I want you to make a change as the Kroger manager so that everyone can have different resources.
Can I add just one more thing? Because I actually took action on the climate crisis on a local level last night. This just happened to come in my inbox, an opportunity from a rapid transit group. I live in Richmond, and that they were notifying people that the free fare program is not currently funded, though the mayor has asked for it to be in the budget. And so they were asking us to email our council members, city council members, to ask them to support funding this free fare program, which it affects so many aspects of life, including climate. And so that felt like, wow, here's something I could do about climate by emailing this woman that I could meet at like the chalk art festival, like it's such a human way to make change on a local level. And that builds the more of us who do that.
I think we have successfully made it through our slides and last minute YouTube switch over. So wanted to, again, provide the link that Melody put in the chat and is QR coded on the screen to a bunch more resources around creating change on campus. So those big guides, but I think back to that power mapping grid and Melody's good questions of like, who actually controls these levers? One of the things we did on that page was put a list of who is in some of those top positional leadership spaces so that like, okay, the board of visitors, how do I actually contact them? Or who's in charge of our operations management? So gives you some of those, talks about guidelines for campus for reserving and organizing space. And again, we didn't talk as much about it, but some of those sustaining and wellness resources, because if I feel awkward, I was thinking about this, just saying to Calandra, hey, can you turn the transcript on? And I do that in every Zoom meeting. And almost every time I feel that little sense of like, oh, I'm breaking a social rule. That's something for me to work on. But two, I know I need to pay attention to my wellness if I'm going to continue to challenge myself to feel uncomfortable for change around this process. So we wanted to offer you these bites of resources around the frame of power, but also hear from those on this call. And for those of you who are watching after the fact, I hope you'll reach out to us. But what experiences have you had with collective action? And what is it that keeps you from engaging with this work more? What are some of the barriers you experience? So I'd love to hear in the chat or welcome people to unmute themselves.
I could touch on this a little bit. So hi, my name is Meredith Lemke. Sorry, I don't have my camera on. I've been having some internet problems. So last year I was involved with the German newspaper's petition to keep Professor Veronica Burney on the faculty. She was one of the 12 professors who were not renewed by the administration. And so as a newspaper, we basically wrote up a description of, why she deserved to stay. And then we organized a way for people to sign the petition. And we got hundreds of signatures, and people were able to leave comments about why they loved her or why they loved the other professors. And we sent these basically to the different provosts, to the president. And I think it was a very good experience, because despite the fact that they ended up in the end not renewing for her, or actually it wasn't that they didn't renew her, it's that they left her in the lurch and didn't tell her whether or not she would be renewed until well into the late summer. So she just found a new job because she needed job security. So that it was really frustrating. And one of the barriers, I think, to a lot of collective action on campus is this feeling of like, we can do all this work, we can write these petitions, we can express how much we care about something, and sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't, which is, I mean, it's fair. Sometimes you succeed and sometimes you don't. Like the name change of a lot of buildings was a big success, but that took years of constant pressure. It took weekly demonstrations on Confusion Corner about Black Lives Matter, and multiple times they announced they weren't doing it. Or like Catherine Rowe even attended Black Lives Matter protests that were at the corner, and then like the next week would release announcement of like, oh, we're considering it, like maybe, but probably not. And so I feel like there can be this overwhelming sense of, ultimately it's like the donors to the colleges like voices who matter more than ours, or like I think there's a sense on campus of like William Mary likes to talk a big game of certain things, or like, but then ends up being hypocritical because they say like how much like self-determination matters for students, and then we say this is what we want this professor to be rehired, and suddenly their ears are closed. So I think a big barrier is when people see, I don't know how to phrase this, like not when people see the failures, because I think the failures can actually motivate people to work even harder, but when people feel from the get-go before they see the action itself, that students' voices aren't powerful enough, because like it's the money, it's the administration that's always going to be making the end decisions. So I think like regardless of when certain things like fail or succeed, I think the barrier is beginning for a lot of students, because there's a sense of hopelessness from the get-go of like, my voice doesn't matter. But then once you like actually organize around something, regardless of if it fails, like it can make an impact. Like Veronica Burney, she didn't end up staying, but she expressed a very emotional gratitude, even just being able to like see all of the comments people left of like how much they wanted her to stay. So like that is an impact, despite the fact that she is not here anymore. Yeah, so I think a barrier is starting.
I hear you with like sort of the hopelessness to start off with. And I think one of the challenges of activism on a campus in particular is that you only have 4 years. and you only overlap with people who've been here working on it maybe 2 years, 3 years before you. So you don't get the sense of the long game. And a lot of times change is a very long game. That's certainly been true with the environmental movement and sustainability and fighting the climate crisis too. Like it's a long haul thing because it's so big. And the tactics that you used sound brilliant and sound like they must have been very encouraging while they were happening. So what it has me thinking about is how do we help people who have an idea for something they want to change see the hope in the effectiveness of what you did and learn from it. Like when you were describing, and I hope this is useful, but I'm just sharing what comes to mind. When you were describing the outreach you did, brilliant. Like you reached so many of the players in decision making. And it makes me wonder, okay, so it didn't go the way we wanted it to this time. Who else do we need to reach? Who's influencing those decision makers? Who are the alumni that give money? How can we help them to hear this message? How do we get the alumni who are working on this, like in our department 10 years ago, who have now graduated and are giving money? How can we get them to advocate also? Who do we know on the board of visitors? All of those things, like where else is the power if we feel like it's not within our sphere of influence? How do we invite them in? The trouble is that takes a lot of time and a lot of work, and not just like 15 hours of your work on Monday, but like years and years to build up that kind of power. Yeah, so I guess like my main feeling for you right now is empathy, but I also hear the creativity in what you shared and can imagine that creativity building with experience. And I guess I'll just say too, like it's interesting because whenever we as staff want change, what we're told is you have to get the students to ask for it because they're the ones who have the power on campus.
That reminds me a lot of, I had Professor Israel Trimmel last year, and that was when like the whole name change building thing was going on, and the government department was of course in what used to be Tyler. And so they talked about how even like practically everyone on the faculty of the government department signed their own petitions saying, we want this building's name to change. Students had signed, like thousands of students had signed petitions saying, we want this building's name to change. And I literally don't think it was until the college like administration had some conversations with like the Tyler family that any decisions got made around that, because there was so much pressure from faculty and students. But it was funny because I got that same sense of when I talked to Professor IT, she was like, yeah, government department like professors have been pushing for this for a long time, and we feel like we have no power. And then the students are approaching them and we're like, we feel like we have no power. So who does?
Right.
Ends up being the question. And I think the answer was the Tyler family. Because I think they still donate to the college. So that was really an interesting sort of perspective to hear when all of that was going on last spring.
Wow.
And it reminds me as well, like I think both can be true. Like there can be one person or one family that has the decision making, but also like power can be diffused in ways that I'm not always aware of, right? So often when I'm thinking like this person could just make a decision, like make it happen. And there have been moments where someone has thought, I could just decide this thing. I'm like, I don't actually have the power to do that, whether it's real or not. Like that sense of like, if I do this thing, this other impact will happen that will negatively affect what we've said we want to do, right? Like the complexities of finding the right lever and realizing there are multiple pieces of it. It also, I think I'm in this frame of mind because before this, I was in a committee interviewing a candidate for a position on campus. And one of the things that sometimes happens after, if a candidate isn't selected, you'll get a message from them saying like, hey, is there any feedback about what I could have done differently? And I was having the thought of like, yeah, wouldn't it be great if after a campaign for change happens and it doesn't succeed, you could have that follow-up and say like, okay, so what could we have done to make you act differently? And sort of imagining that seems fun, but I'm also remembering that I teach a women's leadership course, and years ago, this was a previous administration, president's administration, we did ask some of those staff to come in and talk about past campaigns for change and what did or didn't make that happen. So I wonder about students who are already doing this or could be doing this, and not just students, but having conversations with those in positions of power about past experiences, right? As Melody was saying, like, I don't want students to lose, Meredith, what you did and like all the wisdom you gained as the influencer, but I also would love that information of like what did or didn't work from the influence. And people love to talk about themselves. And so like the power of an informational interview with someone to say, so in the past, what has made policy happen? I'm curious to hear more about where people have done that, because I can so often sit in the sadness that it didn't work instead of thinking about the future of it.
Oh, I love that offer, Camille, that the library can archive materials from student groups and keep track of these things. Thank you for sharing that, because yeah, I knew that and I forgot it in this moment. So it's good for more people to know it who have better memories than me. I also was thinking, Meredith, in future things, we're at an educational institution. Like, wouldn't it be interesting to have that informational interview, so to speak, in advance or with a campaign? Like, hey, I'm a student. I'm interested in learning about how decision-making happens here. Can you tell me what factors are influencing your stance on this issue? And who has the loudest voices here? How does the system work? Just see what you can learn in that process. Because otherwise, I don't know how you make guesses at who does, but they might be willing to tell you because you're asking to learn.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I do think when I've been thinking about like the history of the big Black Lives Matter push that happened last year and how like freshmen aren't witnessing that this year, because it hasn't been as consistent of a like weekly movement on like the corner and things like that. How will that movement get remembered on campus, and how, like, who will remember it? Particularly when like the leaders of it, like Sally Sanfo, who has been a huge advocate on campus for multiple issues, I believe she's graduating this year. So when student advocates graduate, how does their work get remembered? And I feel like it can also feel frustrating as a student, particularly with the pandemic, to feel like you don't know how to make a difference until your junior year. And then by the time you've learned, you only have 2 years left to work on it. So I'm also wondering if there's like a way that we can transfer histories like this to freshmen more consistently so they have their full 4 years of advocacy.
Yeah, and this isn't an answer to that. And it makes me think about it. So I've been working at William & Mary for over a decade now, as Melody has even more years than that here. One of the challenges I experience as a staff member at a university, in particular in community engagement, is a couple of things can happen around that sustaining. One, you can have like the large student movement happen with programming and a wish to create new things. And then those students graduate with the expectation that that work will continue, but not younger students behind. And so often staff are looked to sustain a bunch of things because we remain. And that's really challenging, to be frank, because our capacity doesn't necessarily grow, but every year or every 4 years, there's a new sort of mindset of students of what they want to see happen. And the expectation that they know they're not going to be able to sustain it. So what can I do to make that work happen? And similarly, or on the flip side, I can't decide what that is. I get to see there be a lot of energy or interest or capacity from students around an issue, and then it goes away, and it's still very important to me and the values of the university, and sort of having to sit back and say, like, okay, what can I do to quietly keep that going until the next round of this issue being forefront comes to play. So I share that just to share the realities of, like, yeah, different roles and relationships to institutions and policies also affect how we create change, right? Like, my role is different for staying than a student is for being here for a shorter time, but that can be challenging to navigate.
I had a question. How do you all decide what to do with your time? Because I get questions all the time, or feedback from students all the time. They feel overwhelmed. There are so many things going on, too many things for them to possibly do everything. And as you've talked about today, some of this really takes some effort and in-depth and time and commitment. So, and you've also mentioned self-care and being aware of yourself and not burning out. So do you have any personal tactics or ways that you go about finding efficacy, but also, not taking on too much?
Yeah, Melody, how do we do that?
Or are we all just trying to figure that out?
So developing a chronic illness is a great perspective place on, like, oh, when I overexert, I physically feel it. I do not recommend illness as a wellness tactic by any means. I certainly appreciate that it has allowed me to do what I could have done without that, which is to say, like, what is justice for my community and what is justice for me in this process? And putting more time into reflection about where my energy and capacity is. One of the things that allows me to feel like an active citizen is that I have cultivated and continue practicing the skill of saying, like, good for the world, not for me. That is not the strategy I'm going to engage in. That is not the issue that I'm going to come to. How I do that on any given day can really vary. Sometimes it is with more guilt or resignation, but focusing and celebrating what I have been able to contribute has been really useful, because naturally, for myself at least, I'm going to look at what I haven't done. And so I make the list of, like, how have I contributed to my wellness and the wellness of others and my environment? When I'm feeling that sense of I haven't done enough, I look at that list. And then I eat a very bland diet for a few days and hope I feel better. That's life.
I would say that right now my life is so full to capacity that I am trusting in the providence of the right things coming my way at the moment when I can attend to them. For example, the rapid transit email last night, or for example, somebody who I happen to talk to who's really passionate about something and invites me to it, and I can say yes. And those, I think, are still really effective. Though before I got busy, aka before I had 2 kids, I was really intentional about the ways that I spent my time in advocacy, because I like doing it with other people. And so over and over again throughout my life, I've just gathered with groups and said, like, hey guys, let's work on this together, or had people in my circle who've done the same thing. And, like, then we start meeting and, like, sharing a meal together and doing some activism, or I attend meetings that groups hold or something, because for me, what's motivating is having that accountability and the fun of other people to do it with and the support. So that's been my deciding factor. Camille, thank you so much for these resources. I'm going to be sharing them with student groups that I know.
Yeah, thank you, Camille. And everyone, are there any final comments or questions before we kind of wrap things up? Come to the end of our time.
Thank you for this event. It's very interesting to listen to.
Thank you for the conversation, Meredith, and for all the work that you've been doing to make our campus better.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to everyone for coming and participating, especially to Melody and Elizabeth, you both, for all of these outstanding resources, and we'll be sharing these in a follow-up email. And I hope everyone takes the opportunity to learn more with you all, because as you said, you've like scratched the surface on some of these things, and there's a lot to learn from you all, and especially that advocacy resource. We try to point people towards that all the time. It's easy to access online.